Nazareth. A girl, probably no older than 15, is alone. And then something enters the room that has no name in the language she speaks. Do not be afraid, Mary. But she was afraid, because she understood even then that saying yes to this would cost her everything. Her reputation, her safety, her future, the man she was promised to, possibly her life. This is not the story of a distant saint, carved in marble, holding a lily, dressed in impossible blue. This is the story of a real woman, a daughter, a wife, a mother whose heart, an old man once told her, would be pierced by a sword. And it was. Today we walk with Mary. Every tradition that has touched her story has tried to protect her from it. They have dressed her in light and put a crown on her head and called her Queen of Heaven. They have made her so holy that she no longer seems to belong to the same species as the rest of us. But the woman inside the Gospels is something more surprising than a queen. She is someone who was terrified and said yes anyway. Someone who did not understand and stayed anyway. Someone who stood at the foot of an execution, watching the worst thing a mother can watch, and did not look away. This video is not a theological lecture. It is not a history of doctrine. It is something older and more honest than that. If you have ever been asked to carry something you did not know how to carry, if you have ever watched someone you love suffer and been unable to stop it, if you have ever said yes to something that cost you more than you thought you had, then this story is for you. From dust we came. And what we find in Mary's story, when we look closely enough, is not the picture of a saint beyond us. It is a mirror. Nazareth. The word itself carries the sound of obscurity. A village of 200 people, perhaps 300, tucked into the hills of Lower Galilee. Not a city, not a crossroads, not a place where history was made or recorded. The historian Josephus, in his exhaustive writings on Galilee, never mentions it. When a man named Nathanael first hears that a prophet has come from Nazareth, his response is not wonder. It is contempt. Can anything good come from Nazareth? This is where she was born. This is where she lived. First-century Nazareth smelled of limestone dust and olive wood. The houses were low, built into the hillside, their walls thick enough to hold cool air against the summer heat of the Jezreel Valley below. The women drew water from a single spring. The men worked the terraced fields that climbed the hills in narrow strips. Everyone knew everyone. Every reputation was a communal property. Pause. And in this village, in a room we cannot see, a girl named Miriam went about the ordinary business of her ordinary day. The Gospels do not tell us what she was doing when it happened, but the earliest traditions of the Eastern Church say she was spinning. Red and purple thread, destined for the temple in Jerusalem. The most sacred thread worked by the most ordinary of hands. Her name was Miriam. We translate it as Mary. But in Hebrew, it was the name of Moses' sister, the woman who led Israel's women in song after they crossed the sea. It was the most common girl's name in first-century Judea, and she was the most common kind of girl. She was betrothed, which means legally bound, to a man named Joseph, a craftsman, a builder. The ceremony of formal marriage had not yet taken place. In Jewish law of that era, she was as legally his wife as she would ever be, but she had not yet gone to live in his home. She was probably between 12 and 15 years old. We do not know the hour. We do not know the season. We only know that in that room something entered that she had no category for. And the world she had always known ceased to be the only world there was. The Gospel of Luke uses a Greek word to describe her reaction to the angel's greeting that is almost never fully translated. Diaterech. She was greatly troubled. Not merely surprised. Not simply awed. The word carries the weight of deep disturbance, a racing mind, the violent intrusion of something that violates every category of ordinary experience. Luke tells us she was troubled by the greeting itself, and then adds, she pondered what this greeting might mean. She was thinking. In the presence of an angel, her first response was not prostration. It was a question forming. Pause, longer, and she asked it. How can this be? For words that contain the entirety of human rationality confronting the impossible. Not a refusal, not a dismissal, a genuine, honest question from a mind that needed, even in this moment, to understand. Modern psychology has a name for what she was experiencing. When two irreconcilable realities are placed before a mind at the same moment, the mind enters a state of acute cognitive dissonance. The world as it has always been, and the world as it is now being told to be. Both real, both impossible to hold at once. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps and built an entire philosophy from that experience, described the last human freedom as the freedom to choose one's response to circumstances one cannot control. To find, inside the impossible, a yes. Mary's response, when it comes, is exactly this. Behold the duel of the Lord. Let it be done to me according to your word. The English translates duel as servant, but in Greek there is no ambiguity. Duel means slave, not a hired servant who may leave, not an attendant with options, a person who has surrendered all claim to their own will, completely, irrevocably. This is what she chose. This is the word she selected in whatever language she used to speak to the presence before her. Augustine of Hippo wrote, in the 4th century, that the angel awaited her answer, that the consent of this girl, in this room, in this obscure village, was required before anything could proceed. The incarnation waited on a teenager's yes. Have you ever stood at the edge of a calling that terrified you? Not a pleasant invitation, not an exciting opportunity, but something that, if you said yes, you knew would change you in ways you could not foresee or control. And did you stand there for a long time, before you whispered or didn't? She said it. She didn't know what it would cost. No one ever does at the threshold. You can only say yes and then find out. And immediately after, Luke tells us she left. She went, with haste, to visit her cousin Elizabeth, who was also, impossibly, pregnant. A barren old woman carrying new life. As if Mary needed to find someone who had also said yes to the impossible, to know she was not alone. When she arrived at Elizabeth's house, before any greeting, before any explanation, she opened her mouth and sang. Not a gentle song, not a lullaby. He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. This is the Magnificat, the song of a girl from a forgotten village in an occupied country, who has just been told she will carry the one who will overturn the order of the world. She sang it before the birth, before the manger, before the flight and the exile and the cross. She sang it standing in her cousin's doorway, still trembling from what had just happened to her, with nothing yet to show for any of it. But singing in a doorway is one thing. What came next was 90 miles on foot, a stable in a strange city, and the particular vulnerability of giving birth to the Son of God in the dark. The census decree came from Rome. Every person in the empire was to be registered in the city of their ancestral family. Joseph's family was from Bethlehem in Judea, which meant Bethlehem is where they had to go. 90 miles. In the final weeks of pregnancy. We do not know how she made that journey. Tradition has given her a donkey, but the Gospels say nothing about a donkey. She may have walked much of it. The terrain passes through the Jezreel Valley, flat, exposed, visible from a distance, and then climbs into the hill country of Judea on roads that are steep and rocky and, in winter, cold. The journey would have taken between 4 and 7 days, depending on the pace, depending on how she was doing. There is no drama recorded for this journey, no miracles, no angels. Just a pregnant woman and a man who had chosen to believe an impossible story, walking toward a city neither of them had likely ever visited, in obedience to a census that had nothing to do with their plans. This is the most realistic detail in the entire nativity story, and it is the one we pass over most quickly. When they arrived, the Cataluma was full. The word is usually translated inn, but its meaning is closer to guest room. The same word appears in Luke 22, where Jesus asks his disciples to prepare a Cataluma for the Passover meal. It is a room in a house, not a roadside inn. The family home's guest room was already full of other travelers. What they were offered instead was the lower level of the house, the cave room carved into the limestone hill where the animals were kept, warm from the animals' bodies, smelling of hay and manure and the particular intimacy of living things gathered in a small space. Here, in this room, she gave birth. We do not know if there was anyone to help her. The midwife, if there was one, goes unmentioned. Joseph is there. Whether he knew what to do, we cannot say. Luke records only the result. She gave birth, and she wrapped him in swaddling cloths, and she laid him in a manger. She did those things. Not the angels who would appear to the shepherds in the fields. Not Joseph, though he was there. She wrapped him. She laid him down. There is a word used in Greek for the cloth that wraps a newborn, and there is a word used for the cloth that wraps a body for burial. They are the same word. She wrapped him in swaddling cloths the night he was born. And 33 years later, a man named Joseph of Arimathea would wrap the same body in burial cloth. She was the first to hold him, and at the end, she would be the last to let go. Brené Brown has written that the most vulnerable thing a human being can do is to love something they cannot protect. Mary held the Son of God in her arms, in a cave, in a city that had no room for them, and she already loved him in the way that only a mother can love, which is completely and without reservation and in full knowledge that you cannot keep this person safe forever. The shepherds came first, then later the wise men from the east, gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. Myrrh, the resin used to anoint the dead. One of the first gifts placed at the feet of this child was an anointing oil for burial. Luke says that Mary, hearing all the things the shepherds said about the angels and the sky and the announcement of peace, pondered them in her heart. She didn't speak. She held what she was given and turned it over in the deep quiet of herself, the way you do when something is too large to fully open, and you are not yet sure you have the strength to look at what's inside. She would not have long before someone opened it for her, and what he told her would stay with her for the rest of her life. Jewish purification law required a mother to present herself at the temple 40 days after the birth of a male child. So they came to Jerusalem and they brought 2 doves, the offering of the poor, and they entered the temple courts. There was an old man there named Simeon. Luke says the Holy Spirit had promised him that he would not die before he had seen the Messiah. He had waited a very long time for that promise to be kept. When Joseph and Mary brought the child in, Simeon took him in his arms and spoke words that have been sung in churches every evening for 2,000 years. Now you can let your servant go in peace. My eyes have seen your salvation. And then he turned to Mary, and what he said was this: a sword will pierce your own soul too. The Greek word is rhamphea, not a small blade, not a metaphorical sting, a Thracian war sword, the largest, most brutal cutting weapon of the ancient world, used in battle to sever limbs. Simeon chose this word carefully. He wanted her to know that what was coming was not a wound she would survive easily. And she heard this in the temple, surrounded by strangers, holding a 40-day-old child. What happens to a person when they are told in advance that they will suffer? Psychologists who study anticipatory grief, the grief that lives in you before the loss has fully arrived, note something that seems counterintuitive. Knowing a wound is coming does not make the wound smaller when it arrives. It extends the suffering. Every day between the prophecy and its fulfillment is shadowed. Every moment of joy carries within it the knowledge of what is waiting on the other side. Mary lived with Simeon's words for 30 years. Every time she watched her son play, every time she heard him laugh, every time she watched him grow stronger, more confident, more certain of who he was, some part of her was holding Simeon's prophecy in the back of her mind. And then there was the afternoon in Jerusalem when he was 12. They had come for Passover, as they did every year, with a large group of family and neighbors. When the feast was over, the group turned north and began the walk home to Galilee. It was only after a full day of travel that Joseph and Mary realized the boy was not with them. Not with the women at the front of the group. Not with the men at the back. Not with the cousins and the neighbors. Nowhere. They turned back. They returned to Jerusalem, and for 3 days they searched for him. Luke records Mary's words when they finally found him in the temple. She had been composing them, probably, since the moment she realized he was gone. 3 days is a long time to rehearse what you will say. Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety. The Greek word for anxiety here is odonomenoi. It means in pain, not worried, not concerned, in pain. And Jesus, at 12 years old, looked at his mother and said, "Did you not know I must be about my father's business?" Not Joseph, not her husband, his father. And Luke, with great honesty, adds this: they did not understand what he said to them. She did not understand. The most beloved woman in the Christian tradition, the one who had heard the angel's greeting, who had carried him in her body for 9 months, who had heard Simeon's prophecy and held it in her heart for 12 years, did not fully understand what her son was becoming. And she did not pretend otherwise. She went home. He went with her and was obedient to them, and Luke says, his mother kept all these things in her heart. There it is again, that phrase, that holding. She did not understand. She held it anyway. This is one of the most quietly profound things in all of Scripture. Understanding is not required for faithfulness. You can hold what you cannot explain. You can stay in the presence of what confuses you. You can keep going without having resolved the mystery. And then he grew up, and the day came, as it comes for every mother, when he walked out of her house and did not come back the same way he left. Joseph disappears from the Gospels after the finding in the temple. No death is recorded, no departure. He is simply no longer mentioned. The most reasonable reading of the silence is that he died sometime during Jesus' late adolescence or young adulthood. Probably in the years when the Gospels are also silent, the years between 12 and 30. Pause, which means that for a significant part of what we call the silent years, Mary was a widow. And Jesus was the eldest son, which meant in first-century Galilean culture that he assumed responsibility for the family. He worked, he cared for her. He was hers in the most ordinary human daily sense of the word. And then, around the age of 30, he left. He went to the Jordan River to be baptized by his cousin John. And when he came back from the wilderness, he did not come back to Joseph's workshop. He came back with disciples, and a message, and a life that was no longer primarily hers. At a wedding in Cana of Galilee, she noticed that the wine had run out. She went to her son. She said only, "They have no wine." She didn't ask. She didn't instruct. She simply told him what she saw. His response is strange. He says, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." He calls her woman, not mother. Woman, the same word he will use from the cross when he gives her into the care of the beloved disciple. It is not cold, it is something closer to the address of one adult to another. As if in this moment, He is gently marking the new terms of their relationship. She does not argue. She does not debate. She does not press him again. She turns to the servants and says, "Do whatever he tells you." This is Mary's theology, distilled to 6 words. 6 words that contain everything she had learned in 30 years of holding what she could not understand. She had been told something impossible. She had said yes. She had not understood. She had stayed. She had watched him become something she could not fully follow. And when she could not see the answer, she pointed away from herself and said, "Trust him." There is a particular kind of love that has learned to let go. Not an easy love, not a detached love, but a love that has gone far enough into its own grief to arrive, on the other side, at something like surrender. Mary had been practicing this since the angel left the room. There were days when the crowds threw branches at his feet, and days when the crowds demanded his execution. There was a day recorded in Mark's Gospel when his family, hearing that the crowds around him were so large that he couldn't even eat, went out to take charge of him, because they said, "He is out of his mind." Mary was there. She was with his brothers. They stood outside and sent a message in, calling him out. And from inside the house, he looked at the crowd around him and said, "Who are my mother and brothers? Whoever does the will of God is my mother and brother and sister." This is not the comfortable verse. This is the verse we skip past quickly. He did not come out to meet her. He redefined what family meant. And in so doing, he widened the circle of belonging in a way that was, for Mary in that moment, probably nothing other than painful. She had given everything for this. She had walked the 90 miles. She had sat up through the sleepless nights. She had held the prophecy and the mystery and the not understanding for 30 years. And he was inside a house full of strangers, saying that strangers could know him in the way she knew him. The theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar wrote that Mary's life is a journey from physical motherhood into spiritual motherhood, from the particular to the universal, from my son to all sons. He is right, but he writes it from the outside. From inside, the journey between those two places is not a theological concept. It is loss, and acceptance, and loss again. And then came the day that she had been carrying in her chest since an old man in the temple put a word for a war sword into the middle of her future. Jerusalem, spring. The city was full for Passover. Hundreds of thousands of pilgrims. The smell of the sacrificial lambs already in the air. The Temple Mount bright with offerings and priests. The streets narrow and loud. And through those streets, a procession that was not a festival. A man, carrying a wooden beam across his shoulders. The skin of his back already opened. His face so swollen from the beatings of the previous night that his friends, meeting him on the road, might not have recognized him at a distance. She was there. We do not know where on the route. We do not know who was with her. We know only that John, who was present, records her at the foot of the cross, which means she walked the road to Calvary, or she was already there when they arrived. Either way, she saw it all. Roman crucifixion was designed to take a long time. It was not an efficient execution. It was a performance, a display of imperial power, meant to be witnessed, meant to humiliate, meant to demonstrate what happened to those who challenged the order of Rome. Family members were permitted to stand nearby. They could not intervene. They could only be present to it. John's Gospel says that 4 women stood at the foot of the cross. Mary, his mother, her sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. The disciples, with the exception of the beloved disciple, are not recorded as present. They had scattered. The fear of arrest was real. The women stayed. Trauma psychology has a name for what happens when a person witnesses the death of someone they love, especially a violent death, especially one they cannot stop. It is among the most severe forms of psychological trauma the human nervous system can experience. The images tend to stay. The sounds tend to stay. The smell of it tends to stay. She heard everything he said from the cross. She heard him ask his Father to forgive the people who were doing this to him. She heard him promise paradise to the man dying beside him. She heard him call out, in the words of the 22nd Psalm, my God, why have you forsaken me?" A mother, watching her child ask God why God has abandoned him. There is no theology that makes this easy. There is no framework that absorbs this moment without remainder. She heard it, and she stayed. And then John records something that has been pondered ever since. Jesus looked down from the cross. He saw his mother. He saw the beloved disciple standing beside her. And he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." And to the disciple, "Behold your mother." Even in this, even at the end, even with everything the crucifixion was demanding from his body and his spirit, he looked down and saw her. And he made sure she would not be alone. The Gospel of John uses a single verb to describe Mary's posture at the cross from beginning to end. Histemi. She was standing. Active, upright, deliberate. Most mothers, the ancient commentators note, would have collapsed. Most of us, witnessing this, would have looked away. We would have put distance between ourselves and the unbearable thing. We would have found some survival mechanism that creates a buffer between us and what we cannot endure. She did not look away. She stood. She stood. Emmanuel Levinas, the philosopher, argued that the deepest ethical response to the suffering of another is not to explain it, not to fix it, not to make sense of it, but simply to remain present to it, to refuse to look away, to hold one's face toward the face of the one who suffers and say, without words, "I am here. I see you. I am not leaving." This is what she did for 6 hours. On a hill outside Jerusalem, she stood in the dark and refused to leave. The medieval hymn Stabat Mater, "The Mother was standing," opens with the same verb, Stabat. She stood. An entire theology of Mary's presence at the cross built on one word. The word John chose. The word that all the centuries since have returned to. She stood. And when it was over, when he had spoken his final word and given up his spirit and the Roman soldier had done what Roman soldiers did to confirm the death was real, the body was taken down. And she held him. The same arms that had wrapped him in swaddling cloths. The same hands that had carried him on the road to Egypt, that had pulled him close in a cave in Bethlehem, that had lost him in Jerusalem and found him in the temple. These same hands held what the cross had left. And this is where the paintings go silent, because there is nothing adequate to say. We need to say something that is not often said. Mary did not know it was going to be Sunday. We read the story backward. We read it from the other side of Easter, where the ending is already known. We move through Good Friday toward the resurrection that is already in our hands. She lived it forward. On Saturday, the day between the cross and the empty tomb, she woke up in a world where her son was dead, where the prophecy had been fulfilled, where the sword had passed through and come out the other side. She did not know with certainty that Sunday was coming. She had heard him speak of resurrection. She had not yet seen it. And the Friday she had just survived was not the kind of Friday that leaves room for easy hope. This Saturday, this silence between death and new life, is where most of human grief actually lives. Not at the moment of loss, not at the moment of restoration, but in the middle, in the not knowing, in the space between the closed tomb and the open stone. Mary knew that space from the inside. The Gospels do not record a private appearance of the risen Christ to his mother. This absence is one of the most conspicuous silences in the entire New Testament. The tradition has filled it with conviction. Of course he appeared to her first. Of course she was the first to see the face that had been in the tomb. But the canonical Gospels choose not to say. They say only this: she was in the upper room, after the resurrection, after the ascension, as the disciples gathered and prayed and waited for what Jesus had promised. She was among them, named, present. Acts chapter 1, verse 14. They all joined constantly in prayer, along with the women and Mary, the mother of Jesus. 11 words, her last appearance in the New Testament. And then she vanishes from the written record. Where she went after that, how long she lived, where she died, the tradition gives varying and sometimes contradictory answers. Ephesus, Jerusalem, somewhere that no longer matters as much as the fact that she was, to the end, among the community, praying, staying. And so we ask the question her story has always been asking us, not about her, about ourselves. We began in a room in Nazareth. A girl alone, something entering that had no name, and a question forming in the silence. How can this be? We end in the same place we always end, when we follow a life all the way to its close, with more questions than answers. But perhaps that is the point. Perhaps Mary's story is not meant to resolve our questions, but to inhabit them alongside us. She did not understand the Annunciation. She said yes anyway. She did not understand when her 12-year-old son told her he belonged to a different father. She held it anyway. She did not understand the cross, not fully, not in the way that would have made it bearable. She stood anyway. What she offers us is not an explanation of suffering. It is a model of presence. The courage to remain in the room when everything in you wants to leave. The courage to keep the face turned toward the thing you cannot fix. The courage to say yes again and again and again, even when you cannot see what the yes is leading toward. I want to leave you with a question, not to answer, but to carry. Is there something in your life that you have been circling, afraid to face directly? A call you have not answered, a loss you have not stood still for, a love that would require you to be broken in order to give it fully. Mary, daughter of dust, held the Son of God in her arms in a cave in Bethlehem and did not know what was coming. She stood at the foot of the cross and did not look away. She sat in the upper room and prayed with the others and waited for a promise she could not yet see. She shows us that the greatest strength a human heart can carry is not the strength to be unbroken. It is the strength to remain when you are. From dust we came,